In this demo, I want to get you more familiar with working with design time sample data and some of the D namespace markup extensions that assist you in the design time environment. Starting point here is a simple WPF application project. The only thing I've added here is I've added in the ZA data layer project that we've been using for our data, and I added a view model where this view model class is just set up to expose a customer's collection, and it has some hard-coded data in there right now for a couple of customers that are being put into that collection, but only if you're not in the design time environment. So this is one of the first things that starts tying in with the sample data here, is you can see that you have this switch available to you that we've used before to make sure that database calls did not get executed in the designer. And here I've set it up the way I did before, where it's guarding out the initialization of our data. But in this case, because this data is static data, it turns out this would work okay in the designer. So I'm going to get rid of the not symbol here and make it so that this data is only there if we're in the designer. Now this view model is not hooked up to anything yet. We'll hook this up in a bit. So if I go into my main window and go to the design surface, you can see I'd already added data sources for some of the primary entities we'll be working with. So I'm going to add one more for my view model itself, because it is just a data object that I can bind to its properties. So I'm going to drill down in here and check the box for my main window view model. Now, as we've seen before in other demos, I could then drag this customer's collection out onto my main window, and it would generate a data grid for me. It would hook up the data binding for that data grid, and it would also generate a collection view source for customers. I'm going to reset layout all, and I'm going to drag up the bottom and bring out a text box from the toolbox that we'll also use in this demo. Now, if we go into the XAML and inspect what was generated from the drag and drop of the view model, it's a little bit more complicated than some of the demos we've seen before, but the thing I want to focus on here is this part of the collection view source. I pointed it out before, but it generated a collection view source for the object that we dragged and dropped, and it uses this D design source property. So this D namespace is a special namespace declared up above that contains a bunch of custom markup extensions that are able to detect whether they are in the designer or not. And they're really just using that same code that I showed in the view model to do that detection. So markup extensions like this D design instance can basically null themselves out or make themselves so they do nothing when you're not in the designer. So it's as if these properties are not even here if you're at runtime. So D design source functions like the source property of a collection view source, but it will only set the source if you're in the designer. What it's setting it to is a design instance. So design instance is a markup extension that can create a design time instance of some object. The object type it's going to create in this case is our view model type, specified through an Xtype markup extension. And you can see over here, as we've talked about before, the create list true is part of the collection view source to say, even though we're talking about an entity type here, make it a collection of those entities. So this just gives the designer information about the type that's going to be used, and that allows it to populate some of those design time features, such as the create data binding dialog from the properties window that I showed earlier. However, if we're doing the MVVM pattern, we actually don't want all this extra junk in the way. So I'm going to strip out the loaded event that it added. I'm going to kill these collection view sources. I'm going to get rid of this data context on the root grid. And I'm going to set the binding on the data grid to be the customer's property that we expect to be exposed from our view model. Now I'm going to drop in here and set the data context of the window to our view model. This would be a fairly standard structuring for MVVM. Now the reason I'm doing this is to emphasize something about the designer. I'm going to go ahead and build here. And then we'll go over to the design surface itself, and we see that there is immediately data there. And that is because if we go back to our view model, if you remember, we put this statement in here that says only if you're in design mode, populate the customers with these hard-coded data values. And it emphasizes the fact that in the design time environment, what you're seeing in the designer is live code, basically. It is constructing all the elements in the element tree, and anything done during their construction process is going to be live data. So it constructed the window, and then to set the data context property, it constructed the main view model. And in the main view model's constructor, it checked and said, yes, I am in design mode. So I'll new up this collection of customers and set those properties. Because we're setting customers here, and it raises property change, events fire, and you're actually looking at running code in the designer here. And so this is one way you can get some sample data into your design time environment, is if you have some hard-coded sample data that will be part of the construction process of the elements that are declared, then it's going to show up there. And you can use that to help get your layout right and visualize exactly what it's going to look like. Problem with that approach is you probably don't want to have all this hard-coded data, especially any complex object model, cluttering up your production code like this. And that's where some of the other design time data features come in.